Hey, Coach Adam back here for the third class within the MOVE module for the Essentials of Health and Wellness Google Classroom. For this third class, we're going to be covering conditioning training. Now, we have three primary learning objectives for this class. The first being you, the learner, should be able to recognize the benefits of conditioning training to improve your health, wellness, and fitness. I'd also like you to be able to classify how to effectively train for conditioning based on different goals. And finally, we'd like you to be able to examine generalized guidelines for all different types of conditioning training. First, it's probably worth noting, what is conditioning training? How do we define it? And the reason why we're not saying aerobic training or endurance training is because there are a lot of different types of what we'll call conditioning, right? So the definition of conditioning as we have it is the combined efficiency of the body's systems to complete continuous work over broad time domains, right? So it could be conditioning to run multiple 40-yard shuttles. It could be conditioning to sprint during a soccer game across repeated bouts of effort, but provided that you are sprinting throughout the game randomly, right? It could also be that you are running long distances. Maybe you're training for an ultramarathon. That's a different type of conditioning. Essentially, conditioning is just the combined ability of your body's systems to essentially do work, whether that's running, swimming, rowing, cycling, whatever it might be. A lot of times monostructural work, maybe it's agility or speed movement patterns or sport efforts. Those are all different types of conditioning, right? You probably can't argue you need to be highly conditioned to actually perform at a high level, let's say in the sport of soccer, right? Or in the sport of football, right? It's going to need some level of conditioning. You will need some level of conditioning to be a high-performing athlete in those different modalities. Now, for conditioning, of course, incorporating this into your physical activity plans can yield tremendous benefits. Those include improved mental health, longevity, cardiovascular health, which is my heart health, right? Respiratory health, the health of your lungs and ability to consume oxygen, and then as well as a lot of other benefits, right? Those are just some of the primaries. We also have a lot of different types of conditioning training and like subtypes within those. But again, we want you to really just get a framework for how to think about conditioning, right? So for our types of conditioning training we'll go over, we'll look at endurance, speed, agility, and then circuit training mainly. But again, understand that there are some subtypes, including things like for endurance, ultra distance endurance, well, that's endurance. 1 hour endurance, that's endurance, right? 10 minutes, that's also endurance. So while those are all endurance, they're just different expressions of what we'll refer to as conditioning with endurance as the primary. So just like for resistance training, we need to understand the training principles that go into conditioning. Just like with resistance training as well, we need to understand this. What's the main intended stimulus of any given training session, any given week of training, any given block or month of training, or any given overall training program for conditioning? What's the goal stimulus? Once we understand the goal stimulus, that's essentially how we do the needs analysis, right? So what do we want to improve? That's the first thing. If you come to me and say, hey, I want to get better at swimming or I want to get better at cycling, and I tell you that you should go and do nothing but repeated bouts of 10-second sprints on running, well, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, right? We need to be specific to what you actually want to get better at. If you want to be a better swimmer, you probably need to swim. That's where we get into that training variable of specificity, right? Again, the body will adapt to what you ask it to do. So if you ask it to do long distance swim events, you'll probably get better at doing long distance swimming. But if you've never done long distance swimming and you've only ever done long distance running, we can't guarantee that you'll be tremendous or highly capable at doing long distance swimming because the body adapts to what you ask of it, okay? Our next piece is, of course, if our body adapts what we ask of it, we need to ask it to do the thing we want to get better at, which is our exercise selection, okay? So again, even if I want to get really good at long distance running and all I ever do is long distance cycling, we'll have some carryover, right? My example I like to use is Lance Armstrong ran a sub 3-hour marathon despite never running a marathon before because he was a 7-time Tour de France champion, right? Aside from, the scandal that goes on with him, but nonetheless, being regardless of the exercise selection, he still got better because the body adapted to being able to do long distance endurance tasks. However, if he would continue to train running, he could get better at running, right? Or if you continue to train in a different exercise selection, right, you will get better at doing that modality. If you want to be a really good runner, you're going to need to run. If you want to get better at doing cycling or agility, you need to do cycling or you need to do agility, okay? Our next one then is exercise order. For our exercise order, again, we need to understand how to structure exercises within a training session or within a training block, right? So if multiple systems are being trained, let's say I want to get better at not only being fast at a 1 mile run, but I also want to be good because I'm training for my physical fitness assessment, which is 1.5 miles of running, and then I'm also training for my first half marathon. Well, those are different types of training systems, right? Or energy systems my body is able to produce, right? Well, I can't just train for speed. I also need to train for some endurance, right? So what's the order we should do? And generally speaking, we want to do higher level intensity tasks earlier within our exercise session. So within one training session, if I'm doing multiple systems, let's do the higher intensity system first, such as sprints or agility training, and then move into some more endurance stuff after that fact. But definitely start and prioritize with the higher level of effort, the harder thing, or the thing that is more of a priority during my needs analysis. Next is our intensity and volume. Also similar to our resistance training piece, intensity and volume have an inverse relationship for conditioning training as well. So intensity is essentially how fast to run, and then for volume, how far. We can also replace running with different monostructural patterns such as swimming or rowing or cycling and so on, as we've explored. For intensity and volume, how fast to run? Well, if I'm running really, really, really fast, well, I probably won't be able to go super far. But if I'm running not that fast, I'll probably be able to go a lot farther. That's where we get into the inverse relationship of intensity and volume. The faster I run, the slower I need to ramp up volume or total amount of work, right? So an example I like to give is if I do, let's say, a 2 mile run. A 2 mile run is 3,200 meters. Now let's say that we're doing repeat efforts of 50-meter sprints. Well, if I'm doing 50-meter sprints and I do 100 sets of those, that's 5,000 meters. That's a 5K. Well, I couldn't imagine doing 100 sets of 50-meter sprints. I could imagine doing 75 sets of 100 meters or 50-meter sprints. In that notion, it's because I'm training at a very high intensity. I can't handle that amount of volume. But if I asked you to do that at on a scale of 1 to 10, give me a 6 out of 10 level of effort, right? We call that rating of perceived exertion. If I say, give me a 6 out of 10 level of effort on a 2 or a 3 mile run, well, a 3 mile run is 4,800 meters. However, I'm not going to be able to do that 3 mile run at the same pace as a 50-meter sprint. Definitely not the same as, let's say, 50 sets of a 50-meter sprint, which is essentially close to the same amount of distance, absolute volume, but it's done at a very different intensity because I can only handle so much at that high level of intensity. So be mindful of the relationship of intensity and volume. And then finally, of course, be mindful as well of your overall rest periods. If I want to get better at an endurance event, let's say like ultra endurance, well, my rest periods are going to be quite a bit different than if I'm trying to get really good at a max effort sprint. If I'm trying to get really good at a 100-meter sprint and I'm trying to get a lot faster, let's say for a sport as a goal, right? I want to be a better basketball player and I want to be better at sprinting the full court. Okay, well, we're going to need quite a bit more rest time because sprinting the full court at a max level of effort is going to require quite a bit more rest because it's such a higher level of intensity. So when we're working at different energy system of like how our body's able to produce that, that work, our body, whenever we're training at a really high intensity, needs a little bit more time to recover. Okay. So if I'm training at a very slow, running pace and I'm training for my first marathon and I'm training for a slow run, right? In training for that marathon, I can go at quite a bit longer volume and maybe I don't need any rest time because I'm just doing 10 miles at a 5 out of 10 level of effort. Well, that's a very different necessity, a very different training modality, right? And so when we think about it, we need to understand that higher levels of intensity probably mean I need to rest a little bit more in between sets. But at very low levels of intensity, I might not need as much rest or any rest at all, okay? Again, that's where we come back to what's the intended stimulus. If my intended stimulus is to get better at a 1.5 mile run, well, you can't rest in a 1.5 mile run. So we probably need to get pretty good at doing a 1.5 mile run at what we call our race pace. And we'll talk about some different training interventions or modalities in our last slide today. If you've watched the resistance training lecture before this one, then you'll recognize this is a very similar slide. If you've not, and this is a standalone lecture, then we're going to go over this in full depth. If you'd like to go a little faster through the warm-up and cool-down portion, if you have watched that last class, by all means, speed through this next section. For our warm-up for conditioning training, we really need to understand the importance of a warm-up because of what it can offer us when we think about conditioning. It can help us resist injury. It can help us prime the body for daily movement, right, in that session that we're about to do, and then as well as improve my overall performance on that session. So if I go and do a 1 mile run at a max level of effort and I haven't warmed up, I will certainly have a lower performance than if I did conduct a thorough and appropriate warm-up before I went off and did that session. So how do we warm up for conditioning? It's essentially the same general principles or concepts as we do for resistance training as well. We start off with some general type of warm-up. We want it to be gradual. We start off general and we work into specifics. We start off slow, we move a little faster as we go. We start off with simple movement patterns and then we get a little bit more complex depending on what the session is for that day. So, for example, if we're training for an interval run, right, as you can see in the photo on the right-hand side, if I'm training for an interval run, well, I'm doing that first set at 800 meters. I'm training pretty hard there. Let's say I'm doing this as an interval run to hopefully get faster at a 1.5 mile run effort. And that first set is 800 meters, which is a half mile. Well, I'm going to need to do that at a pretty high level of intensity. So with that notion or understanding, I need to get prepared to run that 800 meter effort at a high level of intensity. And so I'd start off by doing something like a quarter mile, 400 meters of a very easy jog. And then give me 30 seconds at an RPE 7, 30 seconds at an RPE 8, RPE 9, RPE 10, right? Resting roughly 30 seconds between each interval. As you can see, starting off with an easy run and then getting faster and faster and faster for 30-second bouts is a really great way to expose myself to the speed that I'm going to do for my first interval of the day. So that's how we go from gradual or general to specific, right? Gradually getting faster and faster, higher and higher intensities, getting prepared for my primary effort of the day, which is high intensity interval running. This would look a little different if I'm training for sprints, or this would look a little different if I'm training for a long, slow run. We might still be able to do that same warm-up, as you can see from the drop-down menu, but I might not need to do much else, right? Maybe that works for me. But if I'm doing something like speed or agility, I probably should expose my body to a little bit of speed and agility demands at a relatively lower level of intensity than what I'm ready to do for my first set of the day. So starting off doing a little bit of plyometric work or doing a little bit of agility work before I get into more complex agility tasks. Okay, so starting very general and getting more specific to what that session is for that day or what that first challenging piece is for that day is how we warm up or prime ourselves for maximum performance and overall adaptation for all versions of conditioning training. Now that ties in then, let's say we finish our activity and we go to the cool down. The same very, very similar principles apply for the cool down as they did for resistance training, as they do for conditioning. So for static stretching, again, most people don't static stretch for long enough to actually give my body a sufficient stimulus to need to adapt. You need to think about if I'm doing, let's say, 2 miles of running of intervals to make my body more fit. Well, if I asked you to do intervals of that same level of pace, but you only did one interval of a quarter mile, you might not get any faster because my body is essentially necessitates a little bit more total work to get fitter, to get the stimulus that's sufficient enough to tell my body to receive a signal that, hey, you should probably get more fit, right? And the reason why that's important is because the very similar sort of concept applies for static stretching. A lot of times we see people bend down, touch their toes for 10 seconds. Well, that's probably not enough to actually give my body a stimulus to need to actually adapt. So for static stretching, we like to see somewhere around 30, 60, 90 seconds or so to actually cause change in that tissue. And then finally, notice that we put that in the cool down. It might be okay to do a static stretch in the warm-up if you need additional flexibility in your actual resistance training session or conditioning training session. However, almost always it's better to do static stretching during our cool down after my muscles have had a chance to warm up. There's also some research literature that shows that static stretching directly before a high speed or a high agility level of effort could potentially decrease performance. So we put that in our cool down. We also have foam rolling or self-myofascial release. Dr. DeHope will talk about that in a future class, but as a general overview, if foam rolling makes you feel better or potentially reduces your soreness or fatigue levels after a training session, by all means, include some foam rolling or self-myofascial release with like a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball directly after your session is over. We also have breath work. Now, I explained breath work in the previous class, but we have two very basic types of breath work that might help you sort of calm down after a session, which is one reason why I include this in the cool down, is when our body gets really amped up, right? We're in this sort of fight or flight mode. We want to calm ourselves back down after the session and get into more of a resting mode, right? So we can give our body a signal, hey, it's time to rest again after the session is complete by doing deliberate breath work or breathing, such as the box breathing drill or resonance breathing. If you want to go back to that previous class, you can certainly go check those out. Further, we also have injury resistance additions with reactive and proactive adaptability, right? For conditioning training specifically, reactive adaptability might be something like, hey, I was planning on doing a high intensity interval run today, but my knee kind of feels wonky when I'm doing my warm-ups. And maybe that means I shouldn't do my interval running session today. Well, that's okay. You can just switch your modality and go from running maybe to cycling. And if cycling doesn't give you the knee pain that you experience during high intensity running, well, great. I can still achieve my goal stimulus and give my body a stimulus that is going to kind of give my body a signal to still get more fit within that stimulus or within that sort of demand. And I can still get fitter and I can still get better by doing cycling instead of doing nothing, right? As we've explored a lot, motion is lotion. Just because my knee feels a little funky during a warm-up doesn't mean I need to skip the session altogether. Maybe it's just an indicator that I need to change my modality to rowing or swimming or something that's a little lower impact than running on that given day, which is totally fine. And you can still get a lot fitter by changing your exercise selection on any given day. That would be reactive adaptability. Now for proactive adaptability, we kind of have two ways that we can think about this. Number one being, okay, well, when I think about proactive adaptability, I need to think forward and say, well, hey, I know that I can only right now do 5 miles of running on a weekly basis. If I start a new running program to try to get prepared for my first 10K, I probably shouldn't ramp up my volume very high in a very short period of time. However, with proactive adaptability, can I handle adding in a slow hike? Maybe I go for a hike in the mountains. Maybe I go for a bike ride for 45 minutes. That's going to be a very different stimulus than asking you to go for a 45-minute long slow run because I'm getting a little more impact from that running as a modality. So I can pre-plan what we call cross training by changing modality based off of, hey, I want to get really good at running. Well, maybe doing a little bit of cycling or a little bit of swimming might actually enhance my running performance by still doing some work, but changing the modality of that work so I can still give my body a stimulus to respond and get better, right? But being proactive in knowing that, hey, I can only handle so much work before my body starts to respond in maybe a negative way. So I can still gradually progress over time with what I'm exposing my body to so I can get more fit while still hopefully preventing the accumulation of too much load too quickly, right? Further, for injury resistance, we could think about, hey, if I know that I've had knee pain in the past, or I know that I've had shin splints in the past, and I want to avoid that in the future, I can proactively think, what did my physical therapist or what did someone, a professional that I was working with, what did they recommend I do to alleviate that pain or hopefully help it to go away? Wouldn't it make a lot of sense to include some of those things in my general daily or weekly physical activity, right? So as an example, on the right, you can see some injury resistance things like hip airplanes, band around the knees for a goblet squat, right? Doing things like a cat-cow against band tension. Those types of things can still be worthwhile to include into my daily or weekly physical training program to still get better and hopefully resist or lower the risk of overall injury, right? If I know that I've had some knee problems in the past, why wouldn't I try to do some of those things that got me better last time? I should definitely still consider adding those things in there because I can reduce the likelihood or hopefully reduce the risk overall of different types of injurious mechanisms if I proactively plan for those things to hopefully reduce the chance, right? Okay, now some key notes that are very important for our intentions here, right? I need you to understand a couple different pieces. First, our VO2 max. This is a pretty hot topic for a lot of individuals because it's a lot of times tracked on different wearable devices from a lot of different companies. And a lot of people overthink VO2 max and what that really number means, but it is a pretty great proxy for our overall endurance capacity, okay? VO2 max defined is essentially the body's ability to absorb oxygen to help create energy and fuel your endurance performance, okay? For VO2 max, some influential factors include things like your age, you can't change, your gender, your genetics, you can't really change those things. But we have a lot of things in our control that you can change or can improve that are within your control, such as your fitness status, nutritional status, and your body weight, okay? So if VO2 max is my body's ability to get oxygen in through my lungs and give it to my muscles to help produce energy, well, that is sort of an absolute ability to do that. But whenever it's expressed in a number on like a wearable or during a lab test, it's actually expressed as a relative number. The unit of measure for VO2 max is typically milliliters per kilo per minute. Now, when I say per kilo, that's per kilogram of body weight. So if I reduced that body weight number, let's say going from 100 kilos to 90 kilos, and I lost 10 kilos of body weight through a sustained fat loss phase, okay, well then let's say if my performance held steady during that phase and I just decreased my body weight by 10 kilos, well, I'm dividing by a smaller number now. So I may have the same absolute capacity, but if my body weight is lower, I'm actually getting that same level of oxygen to a less amount of tissue. And so in that understanding, we can actually increase our VO2 max by being a little leaner, right? And so that is how body weight influences VO2 max. We can also influence our VO2 max by things like our fitness and nutritional status, right? So by training to improve our VO2 max, we need to work at a high level of effort, right? So our VO2 max is experienced at a very high level of effort. So when we discuss our training variables of specificity, well, if I want to get better at VO2 max, let's say, if I want to improve my aerobic capacity or my endurance capacity through improving my VO2 max, well, I need to work at a high level of effort. I can't just continuously go for long, slow, easy runs or go hop on the bike for 20 minutes at a conversational pace. It won't really improve my VO2 max a ton. It might improve it a little bit, but we need to expose our body to the demands that we're asking it to in order to change in the way we want it to change. So if we want to get better at VO2 max, we do need to work at a high level of effort, right? Because that's the demand our body is hoping to get better at doing. So you certainly can improve it through exercise at low and high intensities, but specificity applies. So definitely know that when you think about trying to improve your VO2 max. Another metric that's important for most people to understand is what's called your lactate threshold. Okay, your lactate threshold is essentially your ability to sustain effort for a certain period of time, right? It's like your max effort sustained for an extended period of time, right? Where it's at a level of intensity that I can probably maintain maybe for like an hour or so, right? Until my fuel reserves in my body start to give out, right? Where I'm building up fatigue at a rate so fast that I can't kind of clear that fatigue at a sufficient rate enough that I can continue exercising at that same pace. So if I ask you to, sustained an effort for an hour straight, well, you probably wouldn't work at your VO2 max. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But you might be able to work at 70% of your VO2 max. You might be able to work at 50% of your VO2 max. Depending on how fit you are or how high your lactate threshold is, you can work at a higher percentage. If my VO2 max is here, my lactate threshold is here. If I get fitter and my VO2 max, maybe let's say stays the same, but I can get better at lactate threshold, I can work at a higher percentage of my max capacity, which is, of course, a great thing to be able to do. So improving my lactate threshold can also improve my endurance performance, okay? That gets a little bit more into fitness performance and endurance performance than it does within the Essentials classroom. So we can talk about that in a future lecture. But for Essentials of Health and Wellness, we'd like to think about lactate threshold as your ability to do work for a sustained period of time relative to my max effort. If we want to get better at doing that, we need to program things like intervals so we get better at recovering between high levels of effort in our sets. So our final keynote is altitude considerations, right? We at the Schriever Guarding Resilience team are stationed just above roughly 6,000 feet in elevation. But what I think is important to note for altitude is that for every roughly 1,000 feet above 4,000 feet, you'll have about a 1 to 2% decrease in performance. So even for those individuals at 6,000 feet, you might experience a performance decrease of about 2 to 4%. What's really easy to look up is go check out the DAFMAN 362905 and look at the altitude adjustment chart. Find what is your ability to do a 1.5 mile run. Then it'll tell you at 6,000 feet, maybe if I can do a 9-minute mile-and-a-half run, it might tell me at 6,000 feet, I subtract 9 seconds for an altitude adjustment. Well, that means that if I were to run that same day at sea level, that means that I could estimate I could do an 8:51 at sea level because it's only a 9-second adjustment. While there's definitely a standard deviation error in there, it's probably within roughly 9 seconds that you could run faster. So if you feel like, hey, I could run a 12-minute mile whenever I get to 12-minute mile and a half whenever I get to Schriever, and then you look at your CSCS or your UFAC and you say, gosh, I'm really a 10-minute person down at sea level, and you say that you could run 2 minutes faster, well, that's probably inaccurate. And if that is inaccurate, well, then we can understand and we look at the altitude adjustment chart, what is the actual effective altitude on my endurance performance? With that understanding, a lot of times what we see is individuals at altitude don't ask their body to perform at a high level in endurance tasks because it is a lot harder. Our body has to work a bit harder when it comes to altitude. So it usually takes roughly 10 to 14 days to adapt at rest for our internal body's mechanisms to adapt at rest to any altitude that I'm living at. But after about 10 to 14 days, your body will only adapt to what you ask it to do. So if you ask it to work at a high level or improve your VO2 max or lactate threshold, you can certainly do that. And over time, again, you'll only see a roughly 2 to 4% absolute decrease in your overall performance over time for, let's say, 6,000 feet. Okay, so we're back into the sort of ish chart for conditioning training. We're going to look at a couple different training styles and talk about how those training styles could potentially improve our overall conditioning performance, right? The first one we'll talk about is the 80-20 rule or the 80-20 approach. This approach posits essentially that 80% of your volume should be done at low intensity and 20% of your volume should be done at a high intensity, right? Now, important to note is essentially this could be great for people that have high volumes of running, right? It could be a solid approach for individuals to help manage total work and still improve endurance performance. However, 80-20 as an approach typically works for people who have very high levels of volume, right? So if you're pushing over 30, 40, 50 miles a week in training for a long distance endurance bout, then that makes a lot of sense maybe as an approach, right? But if you're someone who maybe errs in the lower end of mileage and you're training, let's say less than 10 miles on a weekly basis, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to use 80-20 as an approach. It probably makes a better sense to, let's say, use one of the training styles we'll talk about here in a bit. For our next training style, look at cross training, right? I've kind of talked about this a little bit throughout this class, but cross training's approach is essentially Don't only do the movement you're training for, change it up, right? So I could still, let's say, train for running, but it doesn't mean I can only do running to get better at running. I should absolutely run to get better at running. However, I could also do rowing or skiing, swimming, those kind of things, and still get better, right? What this could do is it could help increase your total volume of work being done without increasing repetitive load to excess levels, right? Cross training is also really helpful as a consideration for recovery days or maybe lower intensity days to, again, get a little bit of active recovery and still get some blood to those tissues, right? So cross training can be a great modality or a great approach for individuals looking to achieve those kinds of things. Now, our next one is what we call tempo pace, right? A tempo workout would be something like working right around race pace to improve your race performance. Now, your tempo pace might be different for someone training for a 1.5 mile PFA versus if you're training for your first half marathon, your tempo pace will be a little different in that training block, which is where we come back to the needs analysis, specificity, and so on, right? But what's important to note is for that tempo pace, right? It's just specificity, as I just said. You need to get comfortable working at your desired race pace. So if I'm training, let's say for a 1.5 mile run, I need to get really comfortable training at what my goal 1.5 mile run pace is, right? Of course, making that a very specific or a achievable goal is important, right? So we're not trying to work at a pace, let's say, far outside my current capacity. Using very small process goals can really help us, and then understanding, hey, how do I feel really comfortable running at my desired race pace? That's tempo training. Our next approach is using aerobic intervals. Aerobic intervals is roughly 2 to 5 minutes of hard efforts repeated multiple times. Doing things like maybe a quarter mile, half mile, those types of distances of running intervals repeated time and again. This is a fantastic way to improve your VO2 max and your lactate threshold. It's also, you could strategize this in such a way that it's mentally engaging, beneficial, challenging, and fun. You can use interval workouts like the ones shown in the Shriver AI program, and then those will help you essentially improve your VO2 max and lactate threshold capacity at a level that's appropriate for you. It's also a really great method to improve my 1.5 mile run or similar performance efforts to a roughly 10 to 15 minute bout of effort, okay? So definitely consider using some aerobic intervals in your conditioning training. So the next one we'll talk about is HIIT. HIIT stands for high intensity interval training. So for HIIT training, essentially that is repeated high levels of effort for short sprints, okay? HIIT can improve recovery between intervals, your overall speed, and your endurance performance. It's a shorter time than long distance, but possibly just as much VO2 max benefits, right? So if you do HIIT training, there's been a lot of research studies showing that you can actually still improve your VO2 max as much as doing a lot longer or lower intensity, steady state types of efforts. For our HIIT, it's the highest yield of all of these for purely conditioning improvements. So high intensity interval training can be a really great stimulus for you to include. And that would be doing things of a little bit shorter bouts of effort with a little shorter periods of rest and doing those as repeated bouts as well. Now, for our next training style, our next approach is sprint efforts. So sprint efforts is stuff that's less than about 200 meters, repeated multiple times with high levels of rest between them, right? An example of that could be like sprinting fast, but you have long enough rest times to maximally improve speed in short distances. So you have plenty of rest to recover before you go about doing another max effort sprint. That's a very different approach than doing like an aerobic intervals, where you're probably pacing that at a roughly tempo pace, roughly around your race pace, or maybe a little faster. A sprint effort is something like, shorter than 200 meters, and I'm doing that as fast as I possibly can. And then maybe I'm pacing myself a little less. I'm letting myself run as fast as I possibly can and doing that repeatedly. Our next one is our agility. Agility is essentially short, quick bouts of acceleration. So it's fast, short bursts of effort. It typically improves change of direction, and a component of agility that is a lot of times overlooked is a lot of times improving my agility includes reacting to external visual or audible stimuli, right? So whenever we think about agility, typically we think about kind of like a sport domain. When I think about agility in a sport, typically people make changes of direction in response to an external visual or audible stimulus. An example of that might be if I'm playing basketball and I'm defending somebody in front of me, well, I'm going to change which direction I'm moving based off of the person in front of me that I'm guarding, right? So it, probably makes a lot of sense that if I'm training for agility, I need to get better at reacting to external stimuli and making sure that those are as specific to my sport demands as I possibly can. So if I'm used to focusing on a ball, or if I'm used to focusing on someone's hips and changing directions based off of, who I'm guarding, well, that should be, emulated in your training environment or your training sessions to improve your overall agility. Now, the final one we'll talk about as well, included in conditioning training, is circuit training. Now, circuit training is another great way to kind of combine resistance training and conditioning training into one session. It includes multiple types of movement in all different types of sequences, right? For our circuit training approaches, it's important to note these are sometimes called metcons. You might hear that as a term, where you're mixing resistance training and conditioning exercises to create a challenging workout. This could be really effective for a short time or to improve your overall well-rounded fitness. So for circuit training, you can incorporate some resistance exercise with some, let's say, endurance exercise or a monostructural movement and overlap those within the same workout and get a pretty great effect. That's one style of approach. Maybe you are someone who is crunched for time and still wants to incorporate some resistance training pieces, and you want to incorporate some conditioning training pieces. You can put those into one session. If you do it effectively or program it effectively, you can essentially do so by using things like a circuit training type of approach, right? And so that kind of does it for our conditioning training section. If you wanted to get a little bit more in depth, you can certainly reach out to your Guardian Resilience Team strength and conditioning coach at any point. But that does it for our conditioning training module. You'll see Dr. Hope for the next one on movement optimization. Thanks.